My first guest represents the 1st District of Kansas in the House of Representatives. He's a member of the Budget Committee. He's also author of the Kansas Marriage Amendment that passed in his home state in 2005. He's very concerned about the current administration's decision to abandon the Defense of Marriage Act. Here to update us on the current status of all these issues is Congressman Tim Huelskamp, right?
Yes, sir.
Huelskamp. Sorry for the mispronunciation earlier. Congressman, we saw this stopgap pass the House. This basically allowed a 2-week buffer where the government would continue to be funded. But there's a lot of concern about what was in that 2-week funding. It did not strip out the Planned Parenthood funding that had just passed the House. Why not? And is this what we're likely to see in the budget that comes before the House in the coming weeks?
That is my concern, and visited with leadership today about that. We worked really hard in the House. Congressman Mike Pence has been working hard on this for years and exposing Planned Parenthood. And so we need to keep the pressure on and say any budgets in the future should include defunding of Planned Parenthood. It's fiscally irresponsible and morally reprehensible to fund this
Eric
entity.
Cantor was quoted this week as saying, Eric Cantor being the majority whip, right? The House has already made it clear we do not support tax dollars going to Planned Parenthood funding, and the Pence Amendment, which would have stripped that, to accomplish the limitation was approved with bipartisan support. As Eric said, we now need to see where the Senate stands on this and other big issues. It seems like people are getting a little weak-kneed over this in the House caucus. Is that what's happening on the Republican side?
Well, we are in a situation where the former Congress didn't pass a budget and trying to get through the rest of the year. But there is a real concern that if we continue to have 2-week extensions, that it won't include those policies. And we'll continue to push, encourage folks, because it's wrong to be funding Planned Parenthood.
It's such a this is such a minuscule part of the federal budget. It's virtually nothing. Why is this a big sacrifice or even a concern? I mean, do you think the Harry Reid and the Democrats are going to shut down a funding bill over Planned Parenthood funding?
I hope we find out. I hope we send it to them. And I think the president and the left is committed to Planned Parenthood. The question is, are we committed enough to life to defund that entity? And that's the real question.
And what about these freshman congressmen that you see on the Hill? Are there enough of them? And is there a groundswell to pressure leadership to make sure that they don't back off on this Planned Parenthood?
I think we're seeing that. Out of the 87 new Republican freshmen, 80 of us are pro-life, and many of us very strongly pro-life, and asking that question and pushing. And this would be the first time any body, any chamber has defunded Planned Parenthood. Numerous states have, like my home state of Kansas, but this is the first time even the U.S. House has done this.
Now, what do you make of this polling that Planned Parenthood has been carrying around, saying 57% of Americans support, don't want the defunding of Planned Parenthood? You buy that?
Well, no. This is the largest abortion provider in the country. Every dollar we give them subsidizes the killing of innocent children. And most folks don't know that. And that's part of our job, is to expose them.
Now, how do you cut this budget? You've got this budget before you. We saw an NBC Wall Street Journal poll that just came out. 54% say no cuts are needed in Medicare. 49% say no cuts are needed in Social Security. How do you arrest this budget if you don't take on Social Security and Medicare?
Well, this is a moral question about tackling our budget deficits. You know, American families and businesses have to balance their budget, and everything needs to be on the table, including our entitlements. And that'll be the discussion. Are the American people willing to continue to pile up debt, or do they want to pass on some type of balanced budget to the next generations? And it's a question not about the people in Congress now. It's about our children and grandchildren. $14 trillion.
If you have a question for the congressman, give us a call. 1-800-221-9460 in the U.S. or internationally, 205-271-2980, or you can send us an email, worldover@EWTN.com. We'll get to them live, so be patient, but you can call in now. Congressman, there's this tug-of-war going on in the states, in Wisconsin, in Indiana, in Ohio, where unions are saying we should have the right to collectively bargain against the government. And governors are saying, we can't afford this anymore. We have to put some limits here, and we have to kind of, the taxpayer has to determine your benefits and your fees at the moment. Where do you stand on this?
Well, the concern here is really, to me, about budget. These states are in red ink. Many of them are near bankruptcy. And the idea that the public sector unions can have wages that are far greater than the average Americans, it's unsustainable. And it's part of it's a function of that collective bargaining and the fact that they have control of so much of the government.
Now, you're a Catholic, and there
Yes,
is
sir.
that struggle because the church reflexively supports the rights of workers and the rights of workers to organize. Where do you consider this falling perhaps outside of that support?
Well, that's a really interesting question. But when the unions are so powerful that they actually dictate pay that's sometimes 25, 30, 50% higher than folks in the private sector, they've grabbed control. I mean, there's no question here about workplace safety, no question about worker conditions, no question about long weeks and hours. It's a question of who has access to the Treasury. But the governments are about broke. And that's the question.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I was exploring this week, and in relation to Catholic social teaching, because the church has always supported the rights of workers, but unions were founded to protect the worker against the abuses of private companies, not to be collectively bargaining against the taxpayer.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's the unique situation I think we have here. There's no health dangers or artificially restricted wages among these public union members. That's not necessarily the case among private enterprise today. So, or in the past. So it's a curious situation.
Well, and the other distinction would be there are 22 right-to-work states, which means you can work without belonging to a union. That means there's 28 states that it's mandatory, possibly. I don't know if that's the case in these states, but that's simply much different. The church has always supported your right to belong to a union or not.
Or not.
And in many of these, you're required to belong to the union, and that becomes quite powerful for the union bosses rather than the individuals.
Father Robert Sirico wrote a fantastic piece this week, which I posted on my Facebook page, and it goes into great detail about just this, the evolution of these unions, and that question of coercion, where some workers, their wages are being siphoned off by these unions and then used to propel agendas totally opposed to church teaching and the things that these workers would support.
And that happens in many of these states where they automatically have the wages taken out for political action committees to push for very leftist causes.
Now let's talk about the Obama administration this week saying it would not defend the Defense of Marriage Act. The Defense of Marriage Act was signed 15 years ago by Bill Clinton, Republican Congress, but a Democratic president signed it. All it says is that marriage will be restricted to a man and a woman, and that every state doesn't have to, if one state decides that marriage between two men or two women is licit, every other state doesn't have to accept it. What's the problem here? And why are you so upset about the Obama administration deciding not to defend this with the Justice Department?
Well, this is simply outrageous. The President and particularly the Attorney General have a responsibility to enforce laws, whether they like them or not. To pick and choose sets up quite a standard. That you mean the President gets to decide which laws on the books are illicit, which one shall be enforced or not.
Well, Eric Holder came out and said he and the President have determined that this is not constitutional.
And the courts have decreed over and over the authority of the Attorney General to not enforce. Has no restriction on whether they think it's constitutional or not, because the courts have upheld these as constitutional. And it's outrageous that someone could take their ideology, and that's the difficulty, and it transcends the law. And that's a real threat not only to the issue of marriage, which is so important, but it applies to any other idea if that's the new standard.
What other options should be considered here? Speaker Boehner said other options were available. What are they? I mean, who is going to defend? It is a federal law on the books.
Yeah, absolutely.
It seems as if the administration's made a decision that, well, let it die via attrition, and by not acting on it, it strengthens the hands of all those who are challenging it in states across the country.
Well, within hours,
and in the federal government.
Within hours, the radical homosexual lobby used that in court. It looks like they were working together, which would be clearly unethical. But the U.S. House plans on, our leadership will put forward a plan to defend this in court. And it's a matter of finding the money, and the money's all in the Attorney General's budget for this, but finding the money to present a defense. And it's going to happen, I think, hopefully next week we'll make an announcement.
But the House can't, and the Senate can't compel the Department of Justice to do anything.
And we'll have to do it ourselves.
So you're basically having to raise your own legal defense.
We're going to have to do that and find our own money, and we don't have a legal budget in the U.S. House, and so that's the difficulties. But visit with the Speaker today about it, and we will have a defense.
Now, traditional marriage and the definition of such in the law passed in Kansas. It's being challenged everywhere. You have a president who said when he was running, he believed in the traditional definition of marriage, that it should be restricted to one man and one woman, and that was fine. And now he says his feelings are evolving on this. He's not quite sure. Should that have any bearing on whether or not this federal law should stand? And what do you think the states will do?
Well, absolutely, it should have no bearing. I mean, the idea that the ideology should drive the law, I mean, that's backwards. Our laws should reflect justice and not changing the laws just because, or refusing to enforce those. But I think the states will mount a defense, but the problem is when you have 5 or 6 states that have allowed homosexual marriage, I think it's working together with the left and the homosexual lobby that has had put this president into office. And I think, frankly, he was dishonest. His past record would show this was not unexpected, but to do it right in the middle of a case in California, a case that marriage was approved widely. Traditional marriage was approved out in California, and it shocked the left. And this is, I think, their payback for this presidency. Do
you really think? I mean, judging when you look out at the pop culture, there is such an embrace, and it's a given that whoever wants to get married should be allowed to get married, and anyone opposing that, you're a bigot.
It is really threatening because on the issue of life with the young people, we are winning that battle. But on the issue of marriage, they have been taught to accept that marriage is nothing special. And that's the battle we have, and that's the battle we have in the courts because this administration has refused to put the evidence forward in numerous cases that said the value of marriage is the value of what it brings to our children. And it's about the children. They have refused to make that argument for at least 2 years now. We will make that argument when the U.S. House defends DOMA, and that's a critical argument.
But the House would have to do it.
Yes, we will have to do that.
What do you see as the next, with this battle looming? Explain to people, so I want to return to the budget for a moment. You've got a continuing resolution which will fund the federal government for 2 weeks. After that, you have to a budget just till the end of this fiscal year. Then there's the other 2012 budget that looms. So there's really two budget battles that we're facing here. What is the likelihood that the Planned Parenthood money will be stripped straight across the board? Or will you have to give in on this fiscal year to perhaps enshrine it in the 2012 budget?
Your guess is as good as mine. It will be a tough battle. It will be a tough battle. It depends, well, who's more committed to life on our side versus the left being committed to funding abortion and abortion providers. This lobby is very powerful. In my home state of Kansas, they essentially control the courts. We have 107 criminal indictments against Planned Parenthood, but the courts in Kansas have withheld and not allowed that case to proceed. It's amazing the battle the power they control, and it'll be a battle. But yeah, we got to finish the current budget, start next year's budget, and those things will be running together within weeks.
Very good, Congressman. Thank you so much for your
Raymond.
time. Thanks for coming on the program, and I hope you'll be back and keep us updated as this. No doubt this battle rolls along.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Up next, Leonard Leo joins us to talk about the murder of a Catholic government official in Pakistan by Islamic extremists and the threat to the practice of religion and free speech around the globe. The World Over Live continues in a moment. Stay right there.